Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. All right, at this time, I would like to introduce our moderator for Panel 2, the Political and Military Nexus of Nuclear Deterrence, General Kevin Chilton. This man needs no introduction. He is a previous commander of United States Strategic Command and a member of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories Board of Governors and a member of the Sandia National Laboratory Board of Managers. Please help me welcome General Chilton and our panelists.
Thank you. I have to say it's really nice to be up here with friends. I'm all for debate, and we will have some, I think, with this panel. We'll have a great discussion, I'm sure. So our topic is political military nexus, and we've got a great panel to talk about this because we have folks that have been combatant commanders, General Kelly, Secretary of Homeland Security. Worked in the White House for 2 administrations, and of course a great combat leader for our United States Marine Corps. And next to him, General Chuck Jacoby, U.S. Army retired, also a combatant commander. General Jacoby and I started our friendship as one-stars working for the world's smartest man, and I say that with great respect, John Abizaid, in the J5 on the Joint Staff. We used to say, we had a deal going between us, if we can ever tell this man something he doesn't already know, we're going to consider this a successful tour in the Pentagon. I'm not sure we ever achieved that. General Abizaid was a tremendous man to work for, but General Jacoby went on to lead men and women in combat in Iraq. He's done so many things in his CV, you have it in front of you there, but culminating in his combatant command of NORAD Northcom, which is something we haven't talked a lot about today, and hopefully we'll get into that perspective. And then last but not least is Sasha Baker, who was the former acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And as we discussed today, we're going to talk a lot about how policy is not what military people do. We provide options to policymakers to achieve the policies that they've set. And so having Sasha here, and with your work in the Office of Secretary of Defense, is going to really add to our discussion here. But the topic at hand, or the title is Political Military Nexus of Nuclear Deterrence. And what comes to mind immediately for me and from the experiences I've had, and I think everybody on the dais has had, is that there's a responsibility that we have, those of us who are deeply involved in the nuclear deterrence business throughout our careers or even partially through our careers, to be teachers of the importance, not only the importance of the deterrent, but also the needs of the deterrent, and to help on the education side in particularly for new administrations when they come in. Typically when a new administration comes in, they have worked very hard on a lot of policy areas, but in my experience, people don't go to the ballot box based on a presidential candidate's position on nuclear deterrence or, for that matter, on national security issues. It's typically on domestic policy issues. And so there is maybe some focus on prepping the next administration, the presidential candidate, key appointees on the things that we're going to talk about here. But I can't help but believe, and there's historical documentation, that in the hours after inauguration, when the president has just come off being sworn in as the President of the United States, and for the first time, someone walks into the Oval Office with the proverbial football and begins to brief him or her on their responsibilities with regard to the deterrent, that ice water doesn't run through their veins as they first hear that. And the same can be said with regard to educating other leaders, many times military leaders, on the importance of the deterrence. At a time period like this, where we know the threat is increasing at a rapid pace, I think we have little time for education. We can't afford, in my view, a strategic pause in the efforts that are underway right now to increase our infrastructure on the National Nuclear Security Administration side, to follow through on the programs of record that are required to ensure that the triad that we enjoy today will be a triad we will enjoy for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. Now is not the time for a pause. And yet if you look in the rearview mirror, this fall and into next year is typically in the cycle where this occurs. And so today I think we want to explore this responsibilities of those in the business of deterrence who do it as military members, and those in the business of deterrence who have done it in the policy world in the past, and how we can move the ball forward and keep the momentum going for the things that I think everyone in this room understands needs to be done, and the many more things that we haven't even contemplated yet. So with that, as just a tee up to the conversation, I want to pass the baton down to General Kelly here to start off with just a few opening remarks to help us get going, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And our intention here is to run this panel like you guys aren't even in the room. It's going to be a conversation up here that hopefully it will be enlightening amongst ourselves, but for you as well, and then greatly encourage Q&A at the end. At that point, we will pay attention. So General Kelly.
Just a couple of comments. In terms of the whole issue of deterrence, first of all, if you've not seen Chili's about hour-long discussion of deterrence that he does, and we present to every one of the newly minted general officers and flag officers in the armed forces at the capstone program, it's an eye-opener to say the least. And I say that because and I do the capstone thing quite a bit. So these folks are very junior. I mean, they're just kids. They're only one-stars. And they're war fighters, they're logisticians, they've mastered their service way of doing business, they've mastered the joint world. And then towards the end of the week-long presentation, Chili does this thing on deterrence, and the vast majority of the people in the room didn't know anything about it. They knew we have nuclear weapons and that, but the whole issue of deterrence and what it means and how it's done and where it came from and all of this. But generally speaking, not that they were ignorant, but not of deterrence and nuclear weapons, but it brings to the front of their minds that, oh my gosh, yeah, we're still in a very, very dangerous world. If you, and I don't mean any disrespect to any group, but if you talk to members of Congress, unless like the gentleman who's on this morning, it's 535 members of Congress, unless you're on one of those committees, like he is, he's on the HASC. Most of the people on the HASC don't know as much about deterrence as he did. Now, you may agree or disagree with his points, but very few on the HASC, House Armed Services Committee, knows as much as he does. But the vast majority of the Congress, who are incredibly important in our process, don't really know much about it. Frankly, an awful lot of the people coming into a new administration really don't know anything about it because it's just not out there as much anymore. And frankly, when they do get briefed on it, whether it's a president or staffers or whatever, it is an eye-opener for them. I remember reading not too long ago where the average person in our country doesn't really realize we have a nuclear deterrent force anymore because they thought it all went out with the end of the Soviet Union. These are great men and women, but I would just close by saying we in the military quite rightly take our direction from the policymakers, from the civilian leadership. That includes the White House, obviously, and the Commander-in-Chief, but also the Hill. And we advise in the development of policy, but we're not policy makers. And so just like if the congressman was here, I'd say everything you said, okay, what are you doing about it? Don't lecture the military guys and gals about doing something about it. Your job, if you feel that strongly about it, is to mobilize the institution you're part of, the United States Congress, and then working with the president and his staff, and then come up with a policy, and then tell us what to do. So I'll end there, Chili.
Great, thank you. General Jacoby?
I hope this is on. It is. Excellent. Okay, well, everything I learned about deterrence in my long time in the military, I learned from Kevin Chilton, and it's his brief right here. that I use as my Bible on nuclear deterrence. And I'm sure that you're all horrified to be having two infantrymen talking to you, one Marine and one Army, talking to you about nuclear deterrence. But I wanted to be here, and I think I was asked to come talk about what were some of the roles of a combatant commander. That's who are the war fighters in our system of joint force operations. And it's a unique position. It has lots of responsibility. It has some important authorities, and it has almost no money. And the money comes from the services, and the services work directly with the civilian political leadership of the administration, and they make the case for programs to the Congress. Now that's a deliberately wicked problem when you've got a president's budget, and then you have the Congress is may take different views, but learning how to properly navigate that and work for those two masters, which ultimately reflect working for the American people, is our responsibility as combatant commanders, and to be accountable for the treasures, which are mainly men and women that serve in our commands, and also the money responsibilities, the treasure of the American taxpayer that goes into all the forces that we work with. And I will tell you that a combatant commander's job also includes important roles in assuring and interacting with the entire interagency, but particularly our allies in the regional combatant commands. And so NORAD NORTHCOM commander, the second thing that I would bring up is that for the period of time, almost 4 years, I was the NORAD and NORTHCOM commander, I could see the needle move from everybody considered my most important role to be defense support to civil authorities, not losing Santa Claus. But the whole time, I watched that needle move to actually Homeland Defense. And thanks to Kim Jong-un for bringing it to everyone's attention. Before 2014 and 2014, President Putin brought it to our attention that maybe we weren't going to be in refit any longer in our relationship with what we considered to be the primary nuclear threat. In the homeland, that meant two things: nuclear command and control, which NORTHCOM had an important responsibility in, and missile defense. All of a sudden, missile defense, which were very, very old and untested missiles and holes, you needed to be able to tell the administration, tell the president that you could deny or defeat and deny benefit of North Korea launching a missile at us with a nuclear warhead. We weren't really in a very good position to do that. And that required working and developing trusting relationships with civilian leadership, both in government and outside, and making the case for the urgency of fixing that particular problem. And now all of you are part of a cabal to help make the case, continue to make the case, that we're kind of in a time of urgency that's required for the emerging threat environment that is now reached the point of being obvious and irrefutable. So I'll talk a little bit more about this idea of making the case. I'll just tell you that I read one line that was worth repeating from the 9/11 Commission report, because I was desperate not to be the failed Army guy, running NORAD and NORTHCOM during Noble Eagle. It said, NORAD knew that there were terrorists interested in using commercial airliners as weapons. But they thought it was too hard of a lift to bring it up with the decision makers, and they didn't make the case. And so that's what we have to do. We have to make the case and figure out the right way to do that with what we're sworn to do, which is be apolitical and support our civilian authorities that are in control of the military. So I'll stop there. A little bit about COCOM business, a little bit about the homeland, and we could go on from there.
Great. Sasha, please.
Thanks, and I want to say thank you to General Cotton and the STRATCOM leadership for having us. Thank you to all of you for coming back after a break. It feels like we might not be quite 800 people anymore, but better than I expected. So thank you for bearing with us. I think I am, or we are, the last thing standing between you all and happy hour. So we're going to try to be brief. You had asked us to maybe think a bit about the moment of transition that we're going into with a new team, regardless of the outcome of the election coming in November, and how do we make the most out of that moment to educate policymakers, to educate leaders about the importance of the mission that everyone here contributes to. And I had the unique vantage point, and I hope nobody's going to end up throwing rotten tomatoes at me when I say this, of being in a position prior to when I was at the Pentagon. I was the Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council, and so I actually led the team of strategists that wrote the most recent National Security Strategy. I then went to the Pentagon, where they were finishing up the National Defense Strategy and the NPR and the Missile Defense Review. And so I had almost by happenstance and by luck, the opportunity to be involved in the creation of all of those documents and then the implementation of them over the course of the last several years. And I've spent some time thinking about what have I learned from that experience and what advice might I give a team of new strategists coming in who are going to be tasked with writing their own versions of all of those documents. And maybe just a couple of thoughts. I mean, first, all good strategies start with an assessment of the strategic environment. And we've talked about this a little bit here today, that we're entering something new. I mean, it is true that the US-led rules-based international order has contributed to the safety and prosperity of not only the United States, but our allies and partners and democratically aligned governments around the world for the last many, many decades. It is also true that we're entering into something new. And we, I think, still today don't entirely know exactly what that is. We're still feeling the elephant in some ways. And, that was the case if you look back at the strategy documents from, let's say, like the late 1940s, early 1950s, the beginning of the Cold War. It was the same. They felt that something big was happening. They didn't quite know what it was yet. They hadn't figured out the contours of the Cold War in its entirety yet. They didn't know what the guardrails were going to be. They didn't know what kind of risk reduction measures they were going to be able to put in place. They had to do some of that work iteratively, and I think we're in one of those transitional periods now. But there are things that we do know. We talked this morning about the challenges of facing a 2+ nuclear peer architecture. We talked about, the increasing alignment amongst some of our adversaries where they are cooperating in ways that perhaps we might not have expected 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. We've talked about the changing threat to the homeland, which NORTHCOM and NORAD have been shouting into the skies for years that this is the case, but I think Washington has finally caught on to the idea that, we have a determined adversary whose theory of victory depends on their ability to block our force projection by targeting critical infrastructure here at home. we've talked a little bit about the challenges that new and emerging technologies overlay onto everything I just described. And so there are pieces of this problem set and this new regime and new environment that we're living in that I think are starting to come into focus. But there's still some, I think, real analytic work to be done and some real opportunity. And what I would like to see, I think there are 3, maybe 4 areas that I would love to see the next team focus on with some real rigor. The first is the questions that we have all been discussing here today around the size of the arsenal and the posture of our strategic forces. And we've talked about the need for growth and size and some of the funding constraints that we face. And I think that that's all real, and I think we wish it away at our peril. I've worked in Congress, I've worked in the executive branch. My experience is that even if the money were to fall out of the sky tomorrow, it would be very challenging, I think, for us as a government to absorb it at the speed and the urgency that you heard the Strategic Posture Commission describing. And so I think we have to be thoughtful about what can we do within some of the constraints that may or may not be, within our control. And I think here the Strategic Posture Commission has laid out some really interesting, what I would consider to be low-hanging fruit, opportunities for the United States to demonstrate flexibility, to demonstrate agility, to put our adversaries a little bit on their back foot. And so I encourage you to take a close look at the recommendations in that document. I think there's some really interesting things there that the next administration could take advantage of. The second place where I would love to see the next administration think big and creatively and boldly is in how we do planning. And we talked about this a little bit before we came up on the stage. But we still, I think, institutionally, in terms of our processes, plan for conflicts in silos. And we may not, we may all know that it is a messier world than that in reality. But when it goes, when things go into sort of the Pentagon planning process and come out the other side of the gonculator, it's there's a plan for China, there's a plan for Iran, there's a plan for Russia. I think we need to think about breaking down those silos in ways that we've started to do around the margins, but we need to be much more ambitious in how we approach it. So, how can we better integrate regional and functional planning? How can we better integrate planning across regions? How can we make sure that we have a shared set of assumptions when we go into a process that takes 18 months to 2 years, only to discover at the end of 2 years that what STRATCOM thought they were working with and what Indo-PACOM thought they were working with were 2 different sets of reality. So I think there is a real opportunity there to bring some agility into that process, and it's something I would love to see the next administration pick up and run with. The third area that I think we've only kind of glanced on today, and I hope we can have some deeper conversations about it either here or tomorrow as the conference goes on, is the role that some of these emerging technologies are going to play in all of this. And so, I think it's a double-edged sword. There are ways in which cyber capabilities, space capabilities, AI, some of these other things that we've been discussing are going to enable and make more efficient our underlying nuclear deterrence. It is also the case that they pose some real risks, and the risk of unintended consequences, I think, is non-trivial and something we ought to take really seriously. And so really thinking through from a sort of theoretical perspective what the intersection of all of these things coming together means is something that I would like to see some folks that are hopefully smarter than me tackling in the next administration. And then the last thing I would say is that, I was sort of dwelling this morning on a comment, I think that it was Barry who made that, we have, when you look at Putin or even Xi to a certain extent, what they're doing is really playing a pretty bad hand really, really well. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, there are fundamental advantages that we as a country bring to the table that we should not undervalue and we should seek to leverage. And chief among them for me is the sort of unique comparative advantage that we have in our network of partnerships and alliances around the world. And we've, I think, done a lot of really interesting things in the past couple of years to help deepen and mature those interwoven relationships bilaterally, minilaterally, multilaterally, and Mallory and others have been at the forefront of a lot of this work, but there's a lot more that we can do there, and that's the thing that scares Beijing and scares Moscow, in my view. So one of the things, I should say, that scares them. So those are some areas that I would love to see the next administration really tackle with new energy, because as I said, I think we're in a moment of transition, but I also think of that as a moment of opportunity. And I think that the conversation that we are having here today is a really, I think, interesting jumping off point to sort of start some of that work. So with that, I will turn it back to you.
You brought up some great points that I want to dive into as well, but first, lest I forget, that's another question I had on my mind. I had a great mentor at NASA. His name was John Young. I think he's the most unsung astronaut in the history of the program. We used to, before we flew our first flights, we would complain about having to go off and give public appearances and speeches, and invariably someone would ask, well, have you flown yet? And you'd have to say, no. Like, why am I here? And John says, don't worry, it doesn't stop. He says, when I go out and talk, they always ask me, so have you flown? Yes. Well, have you been to the moon? Yes. Well, how many times? Twice. Well, did you walk on the moon? Yes. Oh, and they walk away. John had a great dry wit, but in one philosophical moment lecturing to our class, our new class there, he talked about his views on threats to America. And he said, in my view, the biggest threat to the United States of America is ignorance. Ignorance among the population, ignorance among the policymakers, ignorance among our leaders. And I personally resonated with that, but I do not believe ignorance is necessarily the fault of the student. It's the fault of the teacher. Part of the reason for this conference is to turn everybody in this room into teachers. And along that vein, I'd like to ask our panelists what they found as good strategies for educating, removing ignorance from the debate, that whether it was on Capitol Hill, in the National Security Council, in the Oval Office, or in any organization that you ran as you tried to elevate the debate out of ignorance but to a common understanding of the situation. And Charles Jacoby, I saw you pick up your mic, so you first.
Well, I think that's a great comment, and I know that lots of people are concerned about that. And there hasn't been a need to educate and lower that degree of ignorance or apparent need until now all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, we've gradually gotten the message here from our adversaries. In the military, we can direct education. And probably the best guy that does Paul Mill education for the military is the guy sitting to my right, and you can be directed. And we also spend 35, 40 years in service, and so we're pretty much up to speed on things as we go through our career and have continuing education programs. And that's not the case maybe with a new administration. Now, Sasha brought up the point at lunch today that this is, we have an opportunity that one or the other, both of the potential new administrations have some experience. They have some trusted people that they're working with already on national security. It's just not become an urgent topic for them yet. We haven't heard anybody really talking much about it. And so there will still be a cold dose of water for handfuls, but I think that maybe it won't be a cold start for the whole administration. At least, we would hope so. The thing that I think would really help is integrating one of Sasha's points with this. The military gets to do one thing that lots of organizations, most organizations of the federal government don't get to do, and that's to not just plan, but also to exercise plans. And the real challenge has been, how do we get the right people to either hear the outcome of the plan, which we just did yesterday with the degree war game, brought a lot of people in. It was a global look at a regional fight, and there were all kinds of third-party bad characters on the playing field. And the question is, okay, who else is going to get the output of that game, of that war game? It's really tough for other departments and organizations within the government. That's overhead for most organizations, the planner, exercise director, and those kinds of funds. And so I found in the defense support to civil authorities world, I had not that much authority for in the homeland kinds of responses, but I could pay for an exercise and support FEMA, and every single person that was going to show up at a catastrophe for the next year in the room, exchange business cards, shake hands, talk about the plans and the national response plan, and get everybody set for the next hurricane season, for instance. And so I would really like to see some of these war games try to capture some of the folks that are coming in. Just invite them to participate, or invite them to view it and ask questions about it, and then shape it a little bit if it's not quite hitting the mark. The other thing about exercises and exercising plans is we took a stab at globally integrated exercises. It's really tough to do. And all of them fell short when we didn't have political policymakers playing in the room, because it was kind of became an echo chamber. And so I really think some improvements could be made on that, and that we ought to take the opportunity with the new administration to try to rethink how we're doing that. Now, we actually took a stab at globally integrated plans. That falls off with a different group of leaders and comes back and falls off. It really needs to be, we really need to focus on that. Still, geographic combat commanders play an important role because they have the best chance for a fingertip feel for the partners, the allies, and the adversaries around the world, and to be able to offer a place to go for our allies and future allies and partners to come and see if they can become a security partner with the United States, and make a very tough call if that also conflicts with them being an economic partner to one of our two peers. And so, the integrated deterrence issue is working better out there. I mean, the relationship between combatant commanders and most ambassadors and country teams is excellent, but we need to find a way to translate that back into the mainstream. So those are a couple of thoughts on that.
Great. General Kelly, you had a history of working, I believe, way back when in your Marine career on the legislative liaison branch for the Marine Corps and the Pentagon. So you spent some time on Capitol Hill educating staffers. In fact, you guys used to kill us when it came budget time. The Marine Corps, you guys were so good. You'd walk in and they'd say, "What do you need?" "Sir, we just need a few extra shoelaces for our troops. The boots are getting a little worn thin, and 200 F-18s, and they get it all. And the Air Force would be going, well, how'd they do that? But your thoughts on, excuse me, and I hope people don't take this as a pejorative, but when I say remove ignorance or elevate the level of discussion on Capitol Hill, whether it be with staffers or members. Your experience there and your thoughts on that.
We got the F-18s because we deserved them. And we know how to use them. Capitol Hill. One of the things, a unique part of my experience, my career, is I worked on Capitol Hill. Didn't want to do it, but it was fascinating, to say the least. And one of the things that it allowed me to do as a senior officer was not to be afraid of Capitol Hill. Most senior officers who don't have experience go up there, oftentimes grudgingly, to testify or whatever. And the message I give to, on the Civ Mill classes that we give the newly appointed general officers is look at the Hill as, as an opportunity. Look at the Hill as friends. And oh, by the way, they are 1/3 of the government. And yes, we work for the President of the United States and all, but the Hill needs to be informed as well. In my 4 years up there, I did, I think, 54 overseas CODELs. Back in those days, every CODEL was about 50-50 Democrat, Republican, not the case today as I understand it. But there was a real sense of going out and, yes, shopping and doing this kind of thing, but also to learn out there. So, I mean, when the war was going on, the number of times we went through Iraq, or actually the Balkan Wars when I was there. But it is a play, and I believe very much that the Congress is oftentimes left out of an awful lot of decisions. And they are 1/3 of the government, and they have, specific responsibilities. So in all of my time, certainly as a Marine working on the Hill and even Chief of Staff and DHS, I would, every time we would talk about something, I said, we really need to talk to the members of Congress on this. Not that in this particular case they need our permission, but they should be part of the conversation. We need to find out. They represent the American people. Interesting enough, when you look at virtually every president, you read their memoirs or see them when they're interviewed after they give up the Oval Office, one of the things they all say that surprised them when they became President of the United States was how little power they actually had. We talk about, well, the most powerful man in the world. He is really but everything else, quite naturally, because of the way our government is formed and written, they have to go to the Hill. And so most of the time when there was issues, I would say, we really need to get over to the Hill, explain what you want to do. But all of these presidents said it surprised them to no end that they didn't really have all the power they thought they had. Because even if they kind of wanted to move a little bit of money around, they had to go to the Hill. Even if they wanted to do almost everything else, they had to go to the Hill and at least chit-chat and let them know. So, and when you exclude the Hill, naturally you're excluding 1/3 of the government. It's a hugely important part of the government because whatever you want to do as president, they can explain to the American people why it is important. We talk about issues here that literally have to do with the survival of our country. If the United States Congress is not involved in that discussion, so that they're at least aware of it, they can't carry the message back to the American people as to why it's important to do these things or defend Taiwan or why we're in NATO and these kind of things. So hugely important. One of the things I would say to inform and educate, whether it's Congress or the new administration coming in. The first time I did this war game was last year, and it was startling to me. Can't get into it because it's, but there were so many aspects of it that were just so surprising to me. I asked do you brief this to, frankly, the president, to the national security staff? And the answer is no. And it's not a blast at anyone. Typically, we don't do that. So I contacted a number of people, Mark Milley as an example, and said, Mark, do you get briefed on these war games, the end result of these war games? Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, no. I called Senator Jack Reed, who was, in spite of the fact he went to West Point and he spent 5 years in the Army, he's a good friend, but he's the chairman of the SASC, and said, do you get briefed on these things? No. And so I would say, and Tony Cotton, if he knows I say this, beat this drum all the time, to take what we briefed yesterday and brief it to the people that are coming in, And that would include, in my view, the president-elect, whoever that happens to be, to say, this is what could happen. And, Mr. President, I'm going to need, if this, God forbid, happens, I'm going to need these authorities to carry out the mission you've given me. And the time that I call you or ask for the permission shouldn't be at 2 a.m. and you don't know what I'm talking about. And to sit through a war game and debrief it and say, these are the things that I will have to ask you for. And if you say no, I can't defend Taiwan or I can't defend the nation. I think if I had any influence at all, it would be to brief these war games to include the President of the United States. Because the combatant commanders have a boss. It's called the Secretary of Defense. His boss is the President of the United States. Not much of a chain of command there. And if those two people, whoever they happen to be, are not aware of what could happen and how it would unfold and the permissions that the combatant commander would need, they should be well aware of that before, again, it ever, because when it happens, it's going to be, I need to know right now, boss, or I can't do the mission. And so the risk is not on the combatant commander in that case, it's on the President of the United States. So, okay, boss, if you say no, then I can't do what you told me to do, which we don't like as military people because we like to accomplish every mission. But that's one of the things I would say is these war games are critically important. And the fact that General Cotton and his staff and everything are aware of it is very, very important. But there's a hugely important audience, and I primarily would say members of Congress, not all members of Congress, but members of Congress, and then certainly the inner sanctum of the White House.
Terrific. Did I hear you say you did the degree war game last year and they invited you back? They didn't invite me back.
Well, again,
it might have been
Air
because
Force.
we lost when I was leading the war game. So yeah, you get one strike and you're out in that thing. But I'm glad you're still participating in that.
Well, and the other thing I'd offer, and I can't even see, but if General Cotton's here, one of the things, the whole thing about defending the nation is a whole of government. The military is one aspect of it. And everyone tends to think it's just the military. So one of the things that the general has done is, like in the first one, we didn't have like senior representation from the Department of Homeland Security. Well, if any of these scenarios unfolded, our country would be attacked immediately, at least in the cyber realm. And of course, our cities held hostage for the kinetic realm. So DHS should be there at a senior level to understand that, because when we had DHS in the last game, they didn't realize this. I recommended we have people from Commerce and Treasury there, senior people, because anything that happens in any of these scenarios would affect the world economy immediately. And overnight, our lifestyles would change because of so much that we import. And so he's done that now. And then they take that message back to their secretaries to say, boy, if it starts, and are we prepared, is DHS prepared to, they're very, very good at what they do, and they're very good at, like a hurricane, no matter how big it is, they're very good at helping recover. But what if we were talking about cities that have been destroyed, or major things in our lifestyles being affected for weeks and months? Are they prepared? And the fact is they're not. But they're now aware of it because Tony has invited them to come to these things. I think it's hugely important. If we were to show this to a president-elect, some of these things, I think they would go back home.
Well, also, they would, I mean, the answer is we should be pursuing a strategy of deterrence, strength, and deter those kinds of fundamental attacks on the country, whether they're nuclear or non-nuclear strategic. The consequences for any attack on the country in any of the domains is not acceptable from the people that are charged to defend it, and we have to deter it. And so, you get that background, you go, wow, we can't let that happen. That's what you walk away with.
Great. And Sasha, I'd like to turn to you and see your thoughts on communicating and educating, and particularly in the area of the major focus of this conference, which is not just deterrence, it's nuclear deterrence. and what audience you see in your former position, that, and what you would recommend in the future to educate the American public. They've got to be on board as well, not just the Congress, but the population as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, in my former position, I had really the tremendous privilege, and I see Jim Miller's here. He and I shared the same job, so I hope you'll agree with this. Of leading a team of civil servants and civilians who are some of the foremost experts on nuclear deterrence in certainly the country and probably the world. And these are folks that, you know, many of you here in this room have worked with, you know, on a daily basis. And they have deep expertise, they have deep experience, they've been around a long time, they've seen things that have worked, they've seen things that haven't worked, they've staffed many of us here in this room. And I was really fortunate to benefit from their expertise and their advice. And I think it is incumbent on people like me in my former role who come in as politicals or as you know, sort of the temporary leadership of an organization to elevate those voices and make sure that they are heard in the conversation, not only, you know, in the E-ring of the Pentagon, but also at the National Security Council, on the Hill, and that they get a chance to have their voice heard through some of the documents and other things that we create and we put out publicly to make the case to the American public. And when that does, and by the way, that's not always convenient, right? Because sometimes they're saying to you, hey boss, we tried that before and it didn't work for these reasons, so your great idea is actually not such a great idea. And that can be not really that fun to receive that kind of feedback. But it's important that we elevate, I think, the voice of the expertise within the civil service and the bureaucracy, even when it's uncomfortable, because that they are the ones who are sort of the keepers of the continuity over time. I also think, and again, I think this is something that the previous panel referenced, it's really important for us to grow the next generation of those folks. And you know, these things tend to kind of ebb and flow over time. People always want to work on the problem that they think is sort of like the most essential thing of the moment. And it's probably true that there was a moment where we took our eye off the ball when it came to nuclear deterrence. I think that's no longer the case. And so recruiting the young policymakers who are going to form the future leadership of not only the Department of Defense but other departments and agencies around DC is really critical. And I think back to a story. I used to work for Ash Carter. I was his deputy chief of staff when he was Secretary of Defense, and he used to talk to students a lot. He would visit universities around the country, and he loved to talk to scientists and people who had a technical background because he was a physicist by training, and he got his start at the Department of Defense as a fellow working on missile defense, and a pretty technical challenge that he was excited to tackle, but it was supposed to be a one-year assignment. And, fast forward X number of years, and here he is as Secretary of Defense. So I think finding the ways to reach out to that population and bring them into the mission is going to be really essential. And it's something we've gotten out of the habit of doing, and we need to get back into it.
Thank you. Earlier, Sasha, right in your opening comments, you brought up a point about siloed conventional versus nuclear in our thinking a little bit. And I'd like to pull that thread a little bit. In my early stages in the military, during the Cold War, we had integrated conventional and nuclear strike plans on the continent of Europe. Today, my sense is we have conventional plans in the Western Pacific and on the continent of Europe, and if someone uses a nuclear weapon, it'll be over to you, STRATCOM, to take care of it. And in my view, that's not the way to deter, frankly. And so any thoughts that you guys have, and Sasha, I'll start with you and we'll work our way back down on one, the need to actually plan an exercise for the possibility of an integrated attack on our forces with nuclear and conventional, and how we would respond to that, de-escalate it, or if necessarily, escalate to win. Is that a good plan? Should we go back to that, the way we used to think about this in the Cold War?
It does sometimes feel like what's old is new again. So, I think there could be some merit to kind of looking at how we've done things in the past and whether there are things we want to resurrect. I'm just such a huge proponent, and it's actually interesting. So one of the only statutory responsibilities of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, it turns out, is plans, integration, and presentation with recommendations to the Secretary. That's the only thing that's written in law. Everything else is sort of, I guess, optional. It didn't feel optional to me, but in theory, I guess it is. Broadening, and it's challenging, right? Because these are documents that are closely held for good reason. But broadening the conversation so that everyone who has a potential stake or equity or perspective on a particular problem, I think only gives us a better solution set at the end of the day. And that's I guess a pretty broad statement to make, but maybe I'll leave it there. I'd love to hear, General Jacoby, what you think of this, because in my experience, it is sometimes NORTHCOM that gets caught holding the short end of the stick, particularly when it comes to resourcing. NORTHCOM, yes.
Well, I like the subject of, how do we make one deterrent force that has nuclear and conventional capabilities and is supported by cyber capabilities, space capabilities, et cetera. So we're thinking about a whole deterrent effect. But of course, we also live in countries and we have allies that live in regions, and so I think the danger is staying siloed geographically when we're going to have global effects. If we have a knockdown drag-out with China, we'll have global effects if we have a knockdown drag-out with Russia. And so we have to think about how we handle that. I go back to what now sounds like one of my hobby horses, I guess, and that's, the strategy that comes out of the guidance from the President and the Secretary of Defense and comes down to the combatant commanders for what we want to accomplish globally. We have to come up with plans and a campaign to demonstrate how we would offer to be successful in that mission. And then you exercise those plans. It used to be, and not too many years ago, 9 times out of 10, we would start those exercises and we would have already had deterrence failure, okay? And so it's a plan for what happens when deterrence fails. And that becomes, okay, we're going to have this many tanks, this many airplanes, and nowhere did, if you were a regional combatant commander, did necessarily the role of STRATCOM and dual-purpose aircraft and what's the messaging that the allies might be most interested in terms of our deterrent commitments. That was not really part of how we were thinking about our planning. And then you make a plan and you go to the Secretary, you brief it to the Secretary, and you have a handshake on risk, right? Like, I need 27 aircraft carriers, you can only have 2. And, okay, so we're going to share that risk. And the guy that ends up holding the risk, or gal, is the President. And of course, the people of the United States. So I think we can do a much better job with not only how we do our planning, but I think we should be talking about every day we are exercising campaign plans globally with an eye towards these near-peer threats plus, and uncovering all of the rotted wood within our thinking and communicate that the best we can. and not for scare tactics, but for educating ourselves and educating the people that have responsibilities for decision-making in that. And so I think that could be a real fix on the planning. I know we've tried to do that before, and it runs afoul of authorities, assumed authorities in the Joint Staff, assumed authorities in OSD, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, you were very eloquent when you explained how did we get our sense of urgency for the Cold War. And the most important part of that urgency was you could count on a consensus amongst the members of Congress, pretty much, consensus in the population. And I think that we probably have some work to do there. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. General Kelly, anything you wanted to add along these lines? And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, we have Putin saber rattling. You know, what happens, have we thought about it? We planned what we would do if tomorrow he shot off a couple of 155 nuclear artillery rounds, which have about a 1 to 1.5 kiloton yield, which sounds really small. It's not. It's huge, and it crosses a threshold that hasn't been crossed since the start of the Cold War. And are we thinking about this on a conventional battlefield? Should we be? Should we be planning for this and how we would respond?
That's kind of, I was about to say, that's at the end of, you know, deterrence is thermonuclear war and 155 shells.
Yeah.
Everything in between. Right now, back during the Cold War, the ground forces in Europe were Army, and they had tactical nuclear weapons. And, you know, the lieutenants and the captains didn't necessarily think about those things, but the generals, division and above, and there were plans, and everyone knew, hoped not, but everyone knew, because of the size of the Warsaw Pact and what they could bring to the conventional battle, that thing could go nuclear in about 4 hours or less. Peace dividend, there's never going to be another war, you know, the wall comes down, thank goodness, all of that. But all of the tactical nukes are in other places now, and we haven't, as military people, we haven't thought of that for quite a while, since really the wall came down. And now, to your point, we don't really have, if he fired a 155 rounds into a NATO country, we don't have any response to that other than if we go much larger. And it's probably time to start thinking about us having the low-end option back, because he's rattling, and we have to take him at his word, as bad as that is.
So just to return to that, I didn't do a good job with the conventional part of that. While we had the great, you know, nuclear deterrent enterprise going full speed ahead during the Cold War, we also had 350,000 soldiers and airmen in Europe, most of them in Germany. And that kept the saber rattling down to a dull roar and manageable. And what that did was it just created enough doubt in the mind of the Warsaw Pact that the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze, and it would end up nuclear, and we would not. And that's Gorbachev and Reagan agreeing that nobody wins a nuclear war, so we're not going to let that happen. And I think that that's kind of the end result of two strong nations with the same table stakes in the game, looking at each other and looking at our capabilities and say, okay, this is not the way. Maybe we should have some arms control. Maybe we should have some risk reduction. And to tell you the truth, we knew Putin was up to something in 2014 when he took Crimea. And there's another world where we could have provided a series of conventional capabilities to the Ukrainians and allowed them to get to the point where they could defend themselves and end the foolishness in eastern Ukraine. And perhaps that would have deterred, I think it very possibly could have deterred Putin from going. I don't think sanctions were going to persuade them not to. So,
You know, we're talking about communicating with Congress, communicating with the White House, new administration, communicating with the American public. How about communicating with our allies? There's a tremendous amount of trust our allies put into our declaratory policy that says we will provide a nuclear umbrella. We will end. But ultimately, we don't get to decide if our allies are assured or not. That's what they get to decide. And so, any thoughts with regard to dialogue with our allies that strengthens and solidifies in their mind our commitment, not just words, but actions that we can and should be taking to send a clear signal that the U.S. security blanket that we offer to them is a real thing. I'll start with you, Sasha. Yeah.
Okay. I think you hit the nail on the head, which is this is not about what we say. I mean, it is about what we say, but it's mostly about what we do. And I think this administration deserves an enormous amount of credit for the investments they've made in building and reinforcing and maturing a number of these alliance relationships in really important ways. I think, you know, the expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland is huge, is generational. I think that Europe as a whole has really, and I know we have some of our European friends are here, so I shouldn't speak for them, but has had its eyes opened in a way to the fact that, you know, a major war on the European continent is no longer something that we can say is unthinkable in the 21st century. And we need to make adjustments, you know, for that reality. And my view on that is, you know, maybe we should have done it 10 years ago, but now is better than 10 years from now. So I think a lot of that really interesting work in terms of the interoperability of our industrial bases, the commitments to meeting spending targets is happening. You look at the Indo-Pacific, the new EDCA sites in the Philippines, the new marine basing locations in the Southwest Islands. You look at the, I think, really, really tremendously courageous efforts on the part of the leadership of our allies in Japan and in South Korea to build, to rebuild some, you know, some confidence building measures and re-engage on an operational level in ways that we had not been seeing in recent years. Infrastructure investments in the Pacific Islands. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I think this AUKUS, we haven't even talked about AUKUS. So I think that there's a huge amount underway, but I think I would be lying if I said that, you know, as I engaged with my counterparts, that I didn't sometimes hear real concern about, you know, yeah, you say that now, but what happens if? And some of the variability in U.S. foreign policy, and I say this and not meaning it as a political statement, but the variability in U.S. foreign policy has created anxiety on the part of our partners and allies about whether or not we will change our minds about certain commitments. And I think the more that we can do to build consensus as a nation about, you know, we are a country that keeps our promises, you know, the more of that we can do, the better.
Thank you. And General Kelly, we talked a little bit beforehand about doing Paul Mill discussions with our friends and allies. There's, when the military to military dialogues happen, that there's oftentimes a little deeper dialogue than there would be. Can you comment on that and what your experience has been in mill-to-mill dialogues with our friends and allies?
I'd start out by saying, in general, the combatant commanders have tremendous influence in their regions, and oftentimes are believed more than the State Department or others that come out there because they're military folks. And when they talk to our allies about the plans to defend and how they would fall in. And it's real to the partners and allies, and they feel confident in that. And it's a good thing because the plans to involve our allies and friends in the war plans gives them confidence that they'll be defended and that America's ready to defend. But they still, in the back of their minds, oftentimes, question whether we'll really be there. For us, a lot of this stuff is academic. We look at, okay, if this happens in the Persian Gulf, whatever. But the people that live there, it is life and death, and it's minutes. So I think, generally speaking, they're confident that they can take us at our word, that we'll be there to help. We're already there helping. That's emphasized or reinforced by the combatant commanders who, as I say, travel throughout their regions, have access to everybody, military as well as political types. So they get confidence from that. But again, there's based on some things that this administration's done, the other administration's done, the incoming administration, if it's one of the particular candidates, they're very concerned about it. But I think generally speaking, they take us at our word, and we should live up to our word. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah, one more comment from me on the homeland is that the homeland, when I started out there, I said, oh my goodness, I can't defend the homeland from the shoreline, and I don't have any authorities or responsibilities beyond the shoreline to some extent, except in the Arctic Ocean. Nobody else wanted to go up there. And the truth of it was, somebody said it earlier, that for me, allies and partners were really the center of gravity, whether they were allies and partners from other countries, or allies and partners within DHS, or allies and partners in the intelligence, because I needed the early warning of what was coming out of CENTCOM to America. I needed to know everything that PACOM could tell me, Indo-PACOM could tell me about North Korean pattern of life of their nuclear forces. I needed to know everything about China's expanding capabilities and what that meant for the homeland and cyber. And so that relationship was really important. Now, another thing happened after 9/11. We began bringing forces home and building gigantic bases at home and sticking all the forces there. That created some uncertainty, and it also diminished what is real life skin in the game in relationships. And so I like the fact that we're back to exercising and stationing where wanted and where needed. And I think that's important to the homeland, because there has to be a focus now of the forward combatant commanders to help buy down the threat to the homeland, unless you want every ship and every fighter plane sitting in the homeland the first time something goes wrong and we get attacked in the homeland. And so I know that's a kind of a strange sounding thing, but as a NORTHCOM commander, I couldn't get all the airplanes in the world, and I couldn't get all the tankers in the world that I needed to exercise the war plan. And so I needed to have my fellow combatant commanders, whether they were functional or geographic, to be conscious of buying down threats to the homeland so that we didn't, first of all, the tip fig could flow, and that we could have the combat power forward.
Well, we're rapidly approaching that point that you mentioned, Sasha, where we are, no kidding, 1 minute away between you all and happy hour. I'd like to bring us back, though, to something we haven't really talked about, the very fundamental issue that I think is of great concern to both the nuclear, STRATCOM's nuclear enterprise, the NNSA, et cetera. I'm a firm believer that the only existential threat to the United States of America, and by that I mean you tear up the Constitution and throw it out, neighbors stealing food from one another, humanity going back to the bottom of Maslow's pyramid across the country. That only existential threat is in the form of the nuclear weapons that both Russia and China have pointed at us. And job one is to deter them from using them, which means every morning the leadership of those countries wakes up and say to themselves, this is not the day I should attack the United States with my nuclear arsenal. And that's in a poker game what you call table stakes in national security and national defense. And before you start talking about anything else that we're going to spend money on, you have to get that right, because it is an existential threat to our way of life and the future of this country. And I think that's something we always have to bring ourselves back to as we close and we think about theater warfare, we think about influence, we think about assurance and everything else. Job one is to make sure our adversaries fear us. They understand that if they cross that threshold, they will not only be unacceptably punished, but whatever it is they have in the back of their minds they think they can achieve by doing that, they will not achieve. And I want to thank this great panel for joining me here on stage today. How about a round of applause for our panel?